Hi everyone, Happy New Year and welcome back to my channel. So in this video I just wanted to talk about my January TBR and also talk about my reading goals for this year. So usually when I set my reading goals for the year, I set it in terms of numbers. So one year I did 50 books, then 30 books, then 20 books, then a dozen books. But I've never actually successfully completed any reading goals I've set for myself by setting the goals in this way. So 2021, I decided to let go of any arbitrary numeric reading goals, and instead I have specific reading goals I've set for myself in terms of the type of books I want to read, in terms of genre and format, and I also have some reading goals set for specific authors I want to read more of this year. To get right into it, one of the reading goals I set for myself is to read more poetry. For as long as I've been a reader, I've read quite widely. I'd read pretty much anything, novels, non-fiction, fiction across all types of genres. I'd read memoirs and autobiographies. But outside of like assigned reading in secondary school, I've never really delved quite deeply into poetry. So that's one of my goals for 2021. Now I had a kind of like vague and amorphous idea of the type of poetry I'd like to begin with, and I knew of some poets I'd like to get into. Even though I'm going into this pretty much blind, one thing I did know is that I wanted to focus on specifically non-Western authors So I went on Twitter and I asked for recommendations. I said, does anyone know of any poets they could suggest to me? I don't want anything like Rupi Kaur, I find it quite corny. Just, any cool poets anyone knows of. And my mentions were inundated with recommendations. I have like a whole list of recommendations to get me going and to last me quite a while. Some at a glance I knew I wasn't gonna bother, like thank you for the recommendation, but others really looked like the kind of thing I was looking for. So yeah, I got quite a few recommendations that way, but instead of doing the thing that usually comes natural to me, which is to just open another tab and start ordering loads of poetry books, I decided to start with some that were already on my shelf. And so the first book of poetry on my TBR is The Prophet by Khalil Gibran. Now I actually had this book and another book on my TBR for this month by Khalil Gibran. I will get to that one in a second. But The Prophet, I basically saw this in Daunt Books in Marylebone. I went there with my good friend Ifat, the Bakahime. I'll link her channel in the description box below. And we were in the Middle East section of the kind of like basement area of Daunt Books. If you ever go there, it's really cool. They lay out all the books by format, and then in the lower level it's mapped out by continent and then specific countries and regions. So we were in the Middle East section and I saw this and it kind of caught my eye because I knew of Khalil Gibran already, which is kind of an odd way to find out about a poet like Khalil Gibran, I think. But basically in secondary school I was obsessed with The Boondocks by Aaron Magruder, and I used to read the comics online, and the protagonist Huey, one of his favorite poets was Khalil Gibran along with Langston Hughes, I believe. So that's all I knew about Khalil Gibran basically. This book is described as a collection of 26 poetic essays by Khalil Gibran. He was a Lebanese artist, philosopher and writer, telling the story of the Prophet al-Mustafa and his conversations with various acquaintances as he returns home after a long absence. The book touches on subjects of universal concern, including love, friendship, passion, pain, religion, and freedom. What I like about this book, just purely on an aesthetic basis, is just how much it feels like a collector's item. Like if I remove the sleeve, you can see there's this lovely embossing on the front page. Inside as well, you've got these lovely illustrations and the book edges are golden. I love that. So this is the first book of poetry on my January TBR, and as someone that has never read poetry for pleasure like that, I'm interested to see what a poetic essay actually is. The next book of poetry on my TBR, as I mentioned, is also by Khalil Gibran, and this is The Little Book of Love. And I bought this one just because of the title, pretty much. Again, visually it is a very nice looking book, so that really drew my attention as well, and I'm excited to get into that as well. And the third and final book of poetry on my TBR, at least for January, is Sidereal by Rachel Boast. Now I don't know what it was about the first lockdown of 2020 that propelled me to dive into astrology, But that's basically what happened. I've been really annoying to all my friends, but I must not have annoyed my friend Ifat again. He got me this book of poetry for my birthday. So it's basically a collection of astrology-themed poems by Rachel Boast. So Sidereal is described as Rachel Boast's first collection, and it's dominated by astral influence and divine chants by unseen or remote causes, but despite its celestial title, Sidereal is full of terrestrial concerns, the traffic and chaos of the human and natural worlds. Ultimately, however, it is the work of a poet who believes that we must also turn our gaze skywards to make sense of who we are, and these poems pursue their elliptical but inevitable orbits through a world where the earthly and transcendent are thoroughly interfused. Above all, Sidereal impresses through Boast's lyrical faith, which through even the worst pain and despair can still offer its clarities and revelations, and announces an important new voice in British poetry. My dabbling in astrology is motivated by a need to just understand myself and the people around me. I don't take it too seriously, I just think it's an interesting way of finding out more about certain aspects of people's personalities, just explanations for why people act the way they do. I just think it's fascinating. And with this pastime I've acquired, I never would have thought to kind of merge it with my reading goal of reading more poetry. So yeah, thanks again Ifat for getting me this. I look forward to seeing how I perceive some of the poetry inside this book. Another one of my reading goals for this year is to read more non-Western contemporary literature. This decision was prompted by the fact that I read two of Sayaka Murata's novels in 2020, the first being Convenience Store Woman and then more recently Earthlings. And I absolutely loved Convenience Store Woman. It was really quick, kind of startling read. Earthlings, I'm still a bit more conflicted by. I really loved it right as I finished reading it, but by the time I finished it and then let it marinate for a while, my feelings became a bit more complicated. In short, I still don't know whether I loved or hated Earthlings, but I do still think you should definitely read it. I recently posted a reading vlog where you can see more of my kind of rambly thoughts on that at the end. But all in all, I don't regret reading Earthlings, and I really loved Convenience Store Woman. And I follow a great account on Instagram run by Monique Jackson called Novel Allure, and she made a post basically telling you all the Japanese authors you should check out. And there were some contemporary recommendations on there, and I've added some of them to my wish list. I'm not going to buy them just yet. Again, with my poetry reading goal, I think it's best that I just get into some of the books I already own. So that brings me to Strange Weather in Tokyo by Hiromi Kawakami. And I bought this in Daunt Books as well when I bought the Khalil Gibran poetry books. So this edition of the book contains Strange Weather in Tokyo, the original story, but also features a new companion story called Parade. So I'm glad I can experience both of those in one go with this edition. Now, I don't know much about Hiromi Kawakami as an author, but Ifat did mention to me that her writing does have a kind of strange, dreamlike quality to it, which definitely piqued my interest. I liked reading Sayaka Murata's work because she tackles kind of sensitive social issues, but she also writes in a really blunt, straightforward way. I'm interested to read something by an author who tackles taboo-like topics, but has a different style of writing. So the brief synopsis for Strange Weather in Tokyo is as follows. One night when she is drinking alone in a local bar, Tsukiko finds herself sitting next to her former high school teacher. Over the coming months, they share food and drink sake, and as the seasons pass, from spring cherry blossom to autumnal mushrooms, Tsukiko and her teacher develop a hesitant intimacy that tilts awkwardly and poignantly towards love. Now, usually I wouldn't be drawn to romance novels featuring age gap relationships, it's just not my thing. But Ifat assured me this wasn't your sweet, comforting romance novel. Hiromi Kawakami doesn't deal in that kind of thing. I was mostly just intrigued by the inevitable twist coming in this book. What is it about it that makes it so heartbreaking? There's a few quotes in the back of the book saying that it's often enchanting but ultimately heartbreaking, an unforgettable evocation of love and loneliness. It just gave me the impression that there's a lot more to this story than what's written on the back in the synopsis. So I'm excited to get into this. Now the next book on my TBR is Freshwater by Cuite, and this has actually been on my list for a very long time. I followed Cuite on Instagram for several years now, and I've never gotten around to reading any of their novels. I believe this is their debut novel, and from what I know about their story and the plot of this book, I think it's somewhat autobiographical, or at least kind of based on their story. Ada has always been unusual. As an infant in southern Nigeria, she's a source of deep concern to her family. Her parents successfully prayed her into existence, but she becomes a troubled child, prone to violent fits of anger and grief, developing separate cells within her. Ada is more than just volatile. She's an obanje, born with one foot on the other side. When Ada travels to America for college, a traumatic event crystallizes her cells into something more powerful. Based in the author's realities and narrated by these selves, Freshwater maps how Ada's life spirals in a dangerous direction as her alters, now protective, now hedonistic, move into control. In this book, Emezi explores their Igbo heritages, spirituality and gender alongside those of Western construction, and invites the audience to think critically about this spirit-body binary. Akweke Emezi, if you know anything about them, identifies as trans, and they use the pronouns they, them, theirs. They're quite open with this. As a Nigerian author, I think this is really big. I already know I haven't read a book like this, especially from a Nigerian author, so I'm excited to read this and then also read the rest of Emezi's published works. And my final reading goal for 2021 is to read more works from specific authors I've chosen. And the first author on this list is Octavia Butler. Octavia Butler is obviously one of the earliest African-American authors to be influential in science fiction. So I was really excited to read Parable of the Sower finally. It's been on my list for years. Like many of the books on my list have been on my list for years. But anyway, I read the book last summer, and I don't know whether it's because I already had an idea in my head of what it would be like, and therefore it just wasn't what I was expecting, or if I'd hyped it up too much in my head. But I didn't really enjoy Parable of the Sower. But at the same time, I think that might be because there's a direct sequel that kind of completes the story. I think Parable of the Sower as a standalone novel, to me, wasn't too enjoyable to read. The way it read felt a bit like just a series of events that keep happening. So with the dystopian setting and just the scene of America being in complete chaos, where only the rich and powerful are safe, is just very, very topical, very on point, very like on the nose. It's what's happening right now. So in the beginning, especially with the backdrop of the pandemic and being in quarantine, it was a difficult read. It took me quite a long time to really get going with it properly. I think like 2 weeks. But as I did start to get into it and read it more steadily, I just wasn't enjoying it. But I think it was just the thought that Octavia E. Butler is such a famous author. She's a pioneer in the genre, especially for authors of color in science fiction. I felt like there was just something I wasn't getting, so I had to just keep going and reading it. But by the time I finished reading it, but I think again that might just be me envisioning something else from the novel. The world building in this novel and just the way it set the scene was very good, and I think once I do get around to reading Parable of the Talents, I'll get a more well-rounded view of the story Butler is trying to tell here. I think one of the main reasons why I did feel that way was because Lauren Olomina, the protagonist, as a narrator, she felt quite impersonal. Like she has awful things happen to her and around her, but I couldn't find myself caring. I don't know whether it's just the apathy I developed in quarantine or not, but yeah, I took plenty of notes. I took my time reading this, and I just didn't really feel connected to any of the characters like that. But yeah, so despite that, I think that makes me even more eager to read Parable of the Talents, just to see how my view on that changes, and to see if I feel any more connected to the characters, if I care a bit more about their motivations. So Parable of the Talents is the next book on my TBR. The next author on my TBR that I also want to read more of this year is James Baldwin. Now, I watched the I Am Not Your Negro documentary film 2 years ago, and I'm just getting around to actually reading Baldwin. Now, if you haven't watched I Am Not Your Negro, I highly recommend it. It's about a 90-minute long docufilm narrated by Samuel L. Jackson, and it's inspired by James Baldwin's unfinished manuscript Remember the House, which is a collection of notes and letters written by Baldwin in the mid-1970s. The memoir recounts the lives of his close friends and civil rights leaders Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr. and Medgar Evers. So I've chosen Notes of a Native Son. So Notes of a Native Son was James Baldwin's first book of non-fiction and was published 2 years after his debut novel Go Tell It on the Mountain, which I think is his more famously published work. Baldwin spent many years in France, where he moved to escape the racism and homophobia of the United States, and died in Saint-Paul-de-Vence in 1987. And I think that aspect of his life, where he was actually living in Paris, is what I'm most excited to read in this book. Even though I've watched I Am Not Your Negro, I am excited to find out more about James Baldwin as a person, and I think Notes of a Native Son will be a good starting point for me before I delve into his fiction works. Another author I want to read more of this year is none other than Naoki Urasawa, and I've got 20th Century Boys here as the book on my TBR. Now, I wasn't going to mention it because it baits me out, but this volume of 20th Century Boys was actually in my December TBR, but I have not finished it because I've been catching up on One Piece, and that is my priority manga right now. But in my defense, this is the perfect edition of 20th Century Boys, and as you can see, it's a big one. It's actually got 2 volumes in one. So let's say I read volume 1, which would be like halfway in December, and in January I'm going to read volume 2, let's say. Anyway, yeah, that's how I'm justifying it. So Urasawa, if you're into manga at all, he needs no introduction. He's one of the greatest storytellers, in my opinion, across formats and genres. His most famous work is probably Monster, which has also been adapted into an anime, but 20th Century Boys is one series of his that I actually haven't read, so I'm going to prioritize that this year, and I'm definitely going to go back into Monster. It's been several years since I watched it, and I've actually read the manga, and I've also got Pluto, which is on my December TBR as well to finish off, but I think I'm going to prioritize 20th Century Boys this month, if not this year. And the last author I've chosen as part of my reading goals for this year is Inyo Asano, and the manga I've chosen for my TBR is Oyasumi Punpun. I actually read Oyasumi Punpun for the first time back in secondary school. I think I was about 16 or 17, and it was the most depressing coming of age story I've ever read in my life. But it's also, in my opinion, a masterpiece. If you've ever heard about Goodnight Punpun, Oyasumi Punpun, and you weren't sure whether you wanted to read it or not, I'm telling you right now that you want to read this. It's very painful, but it's a masterpiece, in my opinion. So I think enough years have passed now. I am going to be 27 this year, so I can probably read this again without it ruining me, she says. But when I did read it the first time, I did read it online, but I'm planning on collecting the manga volumes this time around, so I'm going to kickstart that with volume 1 this month. And because this is a reread, I think I'm going to do a more intentional and thorough job of kind of chronicling my thoughts and feelings as I'm reading through the story again in later videos or blog posts. We'll see. So that's my TBR for this month, and also my reading goals. Let me know in the comments below if you've set any reading goals for yourself in terms of the number of books you want to read, or different kind of books you want to read, or if you've gone about it a different way like I have. And even though I've gotten several recommendations off of Twitter, please let me know of any poets you would recommend to me. Again, priority on non-Western poets in the comments below. I'll see you in my next video. Bye. Oh my god. I'll see you in my next video. Bye.